What if the hardest part of parenting isn't raising your child, but unlearning the way you were raised? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Tarryn, parent coach, and your host. This is the parent thing where we talk about raising emotionally healthy children while also doing the inner work that parenting requires from us. Here's something fascinating. Research consistently shows that many parenting behaviors are passed down from generation to generation, not because parents are intentionally repeating harmful patterns, but because the nervous system learns through experience. The brain builds parenting templates based on what it saw, heard, and felt growing up. Think about it like software running in the background of a computer. Unless we pause to update it, it keeps running the same program over and over, even when we want different results. And eventually, it becomes obsolete. Breaking generational parenting patterns means becoming aware of those programs, choosing which ones to keep, and consciously creating new ones that better support our children. Today, we're going to talk about how those patterns form, how they show up in everyday parenting, and how you can start changing them without guilt, shame, or perfectionism. The first step in breaking generational parenting patterns is awareness, because you cannot change what you do not notice. Many of our reactions as parents are automatic. Maybe you hear yourself say something and immediately you think, wow, that sounded exactly like my mom. Or you respond in a way that you once promised yourself that you never would. That moment can feel discouraging, but it's important to understand something. It's not failure, it's conditioning. The human brain is designed to learn through observation and repetition. From the time we are very young, we are consistently and constantly collecting information about how relationships work, how conflict is handled, and how emotions are expressed. These experiences form mental and neurological templates for behavior. By the time we become adults, many of those templates are operating outside of our conscious awareness. So when your child refuses to listen, has a meltdown, or talks back, your response is often shaped less by the present moment and more by the emotional blueprint you inherited from your own childhood. If emotions were dismissed or punished when you were growing up, your child's big feelings might feel overwhelming or threatening. If obedience was prioritized above connection, your nervous system may interpret disobedience as something that must be corrected immediately. A lot of the times, our nervous systems responds to that as disrespect because that's what it was seen as and perceived as when we were growing up. And if mistakes were met with criticism or shame, you may feel a surge of frustration when your child struggles, makes a mess, or does something wrong. And I have wrong in air quotes. Just the other day, I was at a restaurant and there was a mom and her little boy, adorable little boy, and he had a sippy cup. And he kept throwing the sippy cup on the ground, throwing the sippy cup on the ground, and he threw it on the ground again every time she picked it up. She got so frustrated that she smacked his little hands and yelled at him in the restaurant, saying, "We don't throw our cups." And my immediate thought was, actually, they do. Toddlers throw their cups. That's what they do. It's developmentally appropriate. None of these reactions mean that you're a bad parent. They simply reveal where your brain learned its parenting patterns. Awareness is powerful because it interrupts that autopilot. It's an interception. It allows you to pause long enough to ponder questions such as, where did I learn this reaction or this belief about my child's behavior? Is my reaction aligned with the kind of parent I want to be? Is my response actually helping my children learn and grow? That pause may only last a few seconds, but neurologically, it is incredibly significant. It shifts activity from the more reactive parts in the brain towards the areas responsible for reflection, decision making, and self regulation. In other words, Awareness gives you the opportunity to move from reacting out of your past to start responding with intention in the present. And once you start noticing these patterns, something interesting happens. You begin to see them everywhere in your tone of voice, in the expectations you carry, and in the moments that trigger the strongest emotional reactions. But noticing the pattern is only the first step. Because once there's awareness, the next question becomes what's actually happening underneath those reactions in my brain and in my nervous system? Breaking generational patterns isn't just about mindset, it's also about the nervous system. Parenting is one of the most emotionally activating experiences we can ever have. And when a child is screaming, refusing to listen, or melting down in the grocery store, your body may go into stress mode. Almost instantly, your heart rate rises, your muscles tense, your patience drops, and you suddenly feel a strong urge to shut the behavior down as quickly as possible. In that moment, it can feel like your child's behavior is the problem. But what's actually happening is that your nervous system has detected a threat. Their behavior is actually developmentally appropriate, and what they need is guidance to alternate behaviors, but in calm moments, not in those heightened moments. The brain doesn't just interpret threats as physical danger, it also reacts to social and emotional stress, including noise, chaos, defiance, embarrassment in public, or the fear of losing control of a situation. When those signals appear, the brain activates the body's stress response, preparing you to fight, control, or escape the situation. That's why, in intense parenting moments, many parents feel an almost automatic urge to raise their voices, demand compliance, or punish quickly. It's not simply frustration, it's a nervous system trying to restore order and safety as fast as possible. And here's where generational patterns come into play. If the adults who raised you struggle to regulate their own stress, their nervous systems likely reacted quickly to perceived threats like disobedience, noise, or emotional intensity. Over time, these responses become normalized. So then what happens is your brain learns this is how conflict is handled. This is what authority looks like. This is what happens when someone is out of line. Without realizing it, those same responses can become the default reactions we fall back on as parents, especially during stressful moments. Children's brains work very differently from adult brains. The part of the brain responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and reasoning are still developing throughout childhood. When a child is overwhelmed, whether they're angry, tired, frustrated, or overstimulated, their nervous system moves into a state of distress where they literally have less access to logic, listening, and self control. So, when a child is dysregulated, they aren't learning from punishment in that moment. Their brain is focused on survival and emotional overwhelm. What actually helps a child return to a regulated state is co regulation, the presence of a calm, steady adult nervous system helping guide them back to safety. It doesn't mean ignoring behavior or allowing chaos. It means understanding that before children can access problem solving or learning, their nervous systems need support returning to balance. This is why breaking generational parenting patterns often involves learning skills that maybe no one modeled for you growing up. This may look like learning how to stay grounded when emotions run high, learning how to recognize your own stress signals before they escalate. It may look like responding thoughtfully rather than reacting impulsively. And it also may look like teaching emotional intelligence instead of suppressing feelings. For many parents, this can feel unfamiliar at first because it requires developing regulation skills alongside your child rather than expecting the child to manage emotions alone. But when a parent learns to regulate their own nervous system in difficult moments, something powerful happens. The home environment becomes calmer, conflict becomes easier to navigate, and children begin to internalize the emotional skills they experience through the parent. And once we begin to understand the role the nervous system plays in parenting, we can start moving towards something even more powerful: intentional parenting, where our choices are guided not by inherited patterns, but the kind of relationship and emotional environment we want to create for our children. The goal is not to be a perfect parent. The goal is to become an intentional parent. Perfection in parenting doesn't exist, and trying to achieve it often leads to guilt, pressure, and burnout. Intentional parenting, on the other hand, is about awareness, intention, and growth. It's about becoming someone who pauses long enough to reflect on how their choices, reactions, and words shape a child's development. Breaking generational patterns means asking a different question than many previous generations were taught to ask. For a long time, the focus of parenting was primarily on obedience and behavior. Parents were often taught to ask, how do I get my child to behave? Or how do I stop this behavior as quickly as possible? And even that narrative is so unfair to a child's little body, because behavior looks like sitting down, being quiet, being still, when reality and biology looks like a busy body, a kid who's curious and asks questions and moves around. But when we begin to understand a child's development, when we begin to understand brain science and emotional regulation, a new question starts to emerge. What does my child need right now in order to develop emotionally, socially, and neurologically? That shift may seem small, but it changes the entire approach to parenting. Instead of viewing behavior as something that needs to be controlled, we begin to see behavior as communication. A tantrum may signal overwhelm. Defiance may reflect a need for autonomy. Withdrawal may point to anxiety or emotional fatigue. When we start looking beneath the behavior, our responses naturally begin to change. Discipline becomes less about punishment and more about teaching. Teaching problem solving, teaching emotional regulation, empathy, and responsibility. Connection begins to come before correction, because children are far more receptive to guidance when they feel safe, understood, and respected. And mistakes, both yours and your child's, become opportunities for learning rather than moments of shame and blame. This doesn't mean that there are no boundaries or expectations. Intentional parenting still involves structure, leadership, and boundaries. But that leadership is grounded in guidance, emotional safety, and long term development rather than fear or control. And the beautiful part of this process is that change doesn't require dramatic transformation overnight. Every small shift matters. Every time you pause before reacting, every time you choose curiosity instead of criticism, every time you repair after a difficult moment, you are helping rewrite the emotional blueprint your child carries with them into adulthood. Because the way children experience relationships at home becomes the foundation for how they understand relationships later on in life, with friends, partners, colleagues, and eventually with their own children. So when you choose to respond differently than what you may have experienced growing up, you're not just making a parenting decision in that moment, you're shaping how future generations experience relationships, emotions, and themselves. And that realization leads us to one of the most empowering parts of this entire conversation. Breaking generational parenting patterns doesn't start with perfection, it starts with understanding. Understanding what's happening in your child's brain and inside your own nervous system, especially in those heated parenting moments. That's exactly why I'm hosting a free webinar on March 28th called What Happens in a Child's Brain When You Yell at Them. In this training, I'll walk you through what actually happens in the brain and nervous system when a child is yelled at, how it affects their ability to listen, learn, and regulate their emotions, and what you can do instead that actually helps their brain develop the skills they need. If you've ever walked away from a moment thinking, I wish I had handled that differently, this webinar is going to be incredibly helpful for you. You can sign up using the link in my show notes or the link in my social media bios. I would love to see you there. Because when we understand what's happening in our child's brain, we can respond in ways that build connection, emotional intelligence, and resilience. And that's the parent thing.
Thank you for tuning into the parenting. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you have any questions, feedback,